Albert-Laszlo Barabasi, welcome to the Development by David podcast, my friend. Your work in the formula was gifted to me by a mentor of mine many years ago, and now I give it to my mentees because it's such a hallmark of my self-development. Uh, your book is referred to as a science help book, and it truly is. You are the founding father of scale-free networks and a leading voice on network science. What do I need to know about the man that sits before me today, Laszlo Barabasi?
Well, David, pleasure to speak to you. And what do you want to know?
Where did it all begin?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the origin stories are hard to trace, right? But we should say that I'm a physicist and I was trained in statistical mechanics, which is the part of physics that deals with random systems. And pretty much all our life is driven by randomness and the competition between randomness and order. So I decided to take the tools of statistical physics out of physics and try to apply to phenomena that are way beyond physics. And the first step was stumbling across networks when I was a postdoc at IBM around 95 and building from there the field of network science. And once we had that conceptual tool set of how do you understand large and complicated networks, it opened up opportunities for us to explore a wide range of things. So starting from the subcellular networks within the cell that I spend lots of time on actually on my day-to-day job, all the way to kind of how do networks and other factors influence both scientific as well as artistic and individual success.
I believe there was a moment in your career where you decided or considered looking at the science of disasters and reverted to the idea of the science behind success. Why did
Sure.
you make that change?
Yes, we actually did study disasters, and that was really fun because it was the time when mobile phones just become available. This was before we actually had GPS on the phones and so on. Remember the flip phones and so on. And we got a unique data set from a Spanish company who of kind of who's calling whom, and also the location of the individuals based on the towers they were talking to. And it was that data set that we used to ask the question, how do people respond to emergencies? That is something really bad happens in their neighborhood. Whom do they call? How do they move? And so on. And we kind of looked at bombs going off in the neighborhood of a group of individuals. We looked at earthquakes that affected a certain region, fires, and so on. And it was a beautiful work and a very unique work and very pioneering work. But I remember that it was a disaster when it came to getting published. His journal after journal rejected it, and it was the right paper. And we know afterwards because lots of new work was started eventually based on that work. But at that time, somehow it was not resonating with the community. And I had my student Dashun Wang working on that project. And I remember when we were just kind of talking about what should be his next project, right? Now that this is kind of more or less wrapping up, he said, I said, what do you want to work on? And he said, anything but disasters again. We kind of had a laugh. And I said, okay, if no disasters, how about success? And how about the science of success? And then I kind of meant it as a joke. And then we looked at each other and we said, that's not such a bad idea. And the reason we thought it's not such a bad idea is because we were both network scientists. And in a way, it was just the time when data about the scientific enterprise, like where do scientists published, what is the impact of the paper, citations, and so on, was just becoming available. So as we started talking, we said, if we want to study success, we started to have all these measures, at least for scientific success. And we also have the data now. And this must be a network problem. So maybe we should study that. And that's really how, in my lab, the study of science and eventually the science of success began. And the student, Dashun Wang, has had a fabulous career since then. He was probably one of the youngest full professors at the Kellogg School of Business. If you need another conversation partner about the subject, I certainly kind of go talk with him, because he then turned around as a senior professor now, and he is studying the impact of failure on success. And you might want to hear about that, but that's not my story, but Dashun's.
I, and I'll touch on it later. I know that you say success breeds further success. I'm really interested in hearing the impact of failure on further success. When developing this new field of study, success, how did you quantify or qualify or define success before studying it?
So it was interesting. So the first question we really began with the idea that this is a network effect, right? And hence, we have the right tool set to do that. And immediately we started to think about it. Okay, well, what does lead to success, right? And we said, well, there are two things that really kind of matter, really. The first is performance, right? Are you good at what you do? And the second is really somehow the environment that is kind of looking at that success, right? Or the recognition that comes from that performance. And this was very important because, we all went to school and we did sports and everything. And the fundamental idea behind school, behind sports, behind coaches, behind competitions, is that in order to be successful at what you do, you have to be good at it. And being good at it, meaning that you have to have an objective, ideally measurable performance. And so the first thing, we started out with looking for network effects, and then we realized, wait a second, it is not only a network problem, it's a joint problem of performance and success.
I see and hear you write about how success isn't about performance, it's about perceived performance, and that
Yes.
success isn't about me, it's about us, it's a collective
Yeah.
phenomenon. What do you mean by that?
Yes, indeed. So actually, the introduction to my book is titled "Success Isn't About You; It's About Us," and that kind of acknowledges the fact that in our mind, performance and success are the same, because we say you have performance, you're going to have success automatically. And we realize that these are two very different phenomena that are measured differently, and they follow different laws. And what I mean by the separation of that is that performance is something that you do. How fast you run, how good you are as a podcast host, how good you are at the sales, and so on. Success, however, is what the community sees of that performance, its acknowledgement, and eventually the reward of it. That is somehow your environment needs to observe and acknowledge the performance that you have to turn into success, because success is always something that you get from others, whether it's money, whether it's citations if you are a scientist, right? Whether it's impact or followers if you're in the social media or whatever you do, it's always something that others give you. So that was a very important realization, was because we realized that while in everybody's mind these are connected, we need to separate them. And once we had that insights, we realized that fundamentally different laws apply to performance and to success. And I'm sure you're going to ask about that, and we can go there when the time is right.
I love making this practical for the listeners who might be performing in very ordinary environments, in an office or in a day job.
Mm-hmm.
What we dispelled there, does that mean that employees, for example, need to be performers of their own work, in the sense that they need to be great communicators, public speakers, ambassadors for their own work, but equally their work still has to be excellent? So they have to be excellent at what they do, but also excellent at communicating it to the wider world.
I love this question, David, because you in one question mixed once again performance and success, right? And this is natural, and this is how I was doing it when I started this research, right? Because what I mean is that you need to be excellent at what you do. That's what your performance. And it's not about how you talk about it and how many talks you give and how you communicate about it. And let me be very specific, right? So let's take an area where performance is very measurable. Running, right? Sports, individual sports typically. There you have a one-dimensional measure of performance, how fast you run, right? And the first question is that what is the variability in performance? That is, how much better you are than your colleague in the office, how much better host you are at the podcast than the other host, and so on. And one of the things we realized when we started to measure and analyze the measures of performance is that there were tiny differences between us when it comes to our performance. That may be hard to hear, but that's the truth. And let me give the example of running, right? Usain Bolt for many, many years was the fastest man on earth. When he won, he was running less than 0.5% faster than the loser, which is the number two. And when Usain Bolt runs, he's not running 100 or 10 times faster than me, right? And I'm not a good runner. So, what is interesting about running is that most people know how to run, and Olympic champions run faster, but not 100 times faster, right? 50%, 10% faster than a healthy individual. That's enough for them to win. But what's interesting is that these tiny differences in performances are measurable in case of running because we have a chronometer. But the same applies to many other aspects of our life, whether you are a doctor, whether you are a salesman, whether you're working in an office, that we all have performances that offer are multidimensional. So you don't have a chronometer to measure it, right? But no matter what performance we look at, we find that it's very, very hard to see the differences in performance between people. This is not to say that you cannot distinguish somebody who is good at what they do and somebody who sucks at what they do. That's easy to make that distinction. What is hard to distinguish is two people who are both good at what they do, right? How do you distinguish two good doctors from each other? How do you distinguish two good teachers from each other? How do you distinguish two good podcast hosts from each other? It's impossible because these are multidimensional performance metrics, right? So, what is interesting then is that if we accept that performance is, when technically we say performance is bounded, right? That it cannot go indefinitely, right? There's a upper bound of how fast people can run, how good can you be at anything that you do, right? And if we assume that performance is bounded, it means that no matter how good you are at what you do, there are 10 other people who are indistinguishably good from, like you, right? And if that's the case, who is going to be the superstar? How do we decide when we cannot distinguish people? Because we do pick one or two and we say, you're going to be the famous host, and then we kind of ignore the other ones. And that's the fundamental question of performance and success. How is it that at the top, performance is indistinguishable, yet success is not?
What is the answer to that question? Why does Usain Bolt get the Puma deals and the multi-million pound contracts, and the person in second, I don't even know their name? Why is the credit
Well,
allocation disproportionate?
absolutely. So first of all, let's talk about two things. Usain Bolt is an easy case because he's in sports and there's a one-dimensional measure of performance, right? Which is, in his case, speed. And if we want to kind of say, do we always know who's the best? Well, a few years ago at the Rio Olympics, Phelps, the American swimmer, had to share the top prize with the Hungarian swimmer Che and the third swimmer. And this wasn't because they didn't know who arrived first, right? Because there were videos to show who touched the endpoint faster earlier. But the time difference between them was less than 2.5 centimeters, which is the error bar of the swimming pool. right? So the swimming pools are only certified up to 2.5 centimeter accuracy. So even though they knew who arrived first, they didn't know who swam faster. So we have this situation that even in sports, we're not always sure who's the best, right? And so when you go out of sports, it's almost impossible. Now, let's ask ourselves, maybe, is it really true that there, however, success is not bounded? And that's another thing we have to understand. Performance is bounded, success is not. And a good example is, when I finished my second book, The Bursts, I was in New York talking to my editor, and we were curious just about the book to come out, to like, who is the competition, right? And and there was a book out there who was just kind of published the same week. Two books were actually on the lead. I think it was called The Last Song, and the book did very, very well, right? We had access to the sales number, and it was selling about 200 copies that week. And normally you get the top of the New York Times bestseller list with 3 to 5,000 copies, and with 10,000 copies, you're almost guaranteed to get to the top of the bestseller list. Yet, The Last Song, with 200,000 copies, was number 2. So how is that possible? Because there was a number 1 there who sold 1.2 million copies that week, and that was the latest Dan Brown book. So what I want to kind of emphasize is the difference between 10,000 to 200,000 and 1.2 million, which are possible to coexist within sales. When it comes to success, you're no longer bounded. It can be almost infinite the amount of success you get. And the reason you do that is because you don't do the success. We do it for you. We listen to your podcast. We buy your book, right? And many of us add together and give you this disproportionate success. So this is what I meant, that performance is bounded and success is unbounded. And now comes the question that you were asking, really, how is it possible that I cannot distinguish the performance? And I am not sure that Dan Brown's latest book was any better than the number 2, and many people would argue that The Last Song was much better than the Dan Brown book, right? Then the question is, then why was that selling 1.2 million and not 200,000 or not 10,000 or no copies, right? And so that's where actually the big question comes in of how success emerges, right? And what are the mechanisms by which someone who are good than anybody else, but still not indistinguishable from the top people, you can actually be picked out and thrown into the stratosphere to get exceptional success.
Is that where you say when performance is hard to measure, networks take center stage?
No, I mean, I think once again, it's not problem to find exceptional performance. As I said, it's very easy to identify people who are good at what they do. What is difficult is to see the differences between them. So when we cannot see the performance differences, that's the moment where networks come in, right? So if the performances are easily measurable, you don't need networks, right? The performance uniquely determines success. If you run faster, you are the most famous runner. If you win all the tennis games, you are the most famous tennis player. And everything else follows. Endorsement, money, all of that follows with that. The problem becomes in all the other areas where we don't have chronometers, right? And there we have many top people, and we pick 1 or 2 and turn into a major success, and we ignore the rest of them, even though there's no performance differences between them. And so that leads actually the kind of our law or observation is that really networks come in, that performance drives success, but when performance is not measurable, then networks determine success. And if you want to talk about it, we have to switch to arts.
Tell me about the arts. How do we measure performance in the world of art?
Yes, art is something that I care deeply about. I spend quite a bit of time my time actually in producing artworks for over 30 years. Before I became a scientist, I was studying to become an artist. And so we ended up kind of turning our tool set to also understand artistic success. And one of the things we didn't talk about is that how do we do this, both in science and art? And the key difference between many other books that talk about success and others is that everything that we talk about is data driven. And this is very, very important because I've seen wonderful books that talk about the success of highly successful people, which means that you pick 10 or 100 highly successful people and say, what is common between them? And then you write a fabulous book. Very enjoyable. Except your conclusion may be that one key element of success is start at 6 o'clock, right? But then you look around and you find in your city 500,000 people who start at 6 o'clock and earlier, and they're not successful, right? So one of the things we learned in science is that if you want to understand what distinguishes sick people from healthy people, successful from unsuccessful, you cannot just focus on the successful or on the sick people. You always have to have the people you compare to. And so both in science and art, we end up kind of building big corpuses, all the artists ever, and try to understand where they exhibited, what was the impact of that exhibition, how prestigious was the place. Just like for scientists, we looked at both successful scientists as well as unsuccessful scientists and understand how their career unfolded. And so back to art. Art is a very interesting space because particularly in the contemporary art space, I'm holding the glass in my hand. Is this an artwork or is it a glass that I will drink from? And I'm an artist on the side, so it could be an artwork. You never know, right? And what does it turn a glass into an artwork? Where do you see it, right? Do you see it in a museum like MoMA under a glass box? Then you would see it as an artwork, right? And you wonder, why is it there? If, however, you see it in my hand and you actually see me sipping from it, I do right now, then you know that it's an ordinary glass. So what I'm trying to say is that in art, the objects that the current contemporary art creates are objectively indistinguishable in terms of their artistic value, right? This is not, but they do have artistic value because some works sell for $150 million, right? Contemporary artworks, and others are ignored or you would have to pay to somebody to take it away, right? So what's the difference? And value in art is impossible to objectively measure. What I mean by that if you show the works art to people who don't have an artistic expertise and you ask them to develop an objective measure whether this is better work than the other one, no, it will never succeed. And there were actually attempts to do that. People used AI and many other metrics to try to detect valuable art, and it never works. And the reason why it never works is because artistic value is created by the artistic and professional network. That is, the value of this glass as an artwork depends on whose name is under it, where is it being exhibited, where was it exhibited before, what was the prestige of those institutions, and ultimately, what else the artist whose name you find over there exhibited, how much his previous work sold for. So the value of a particular artwork is really determined by this very complicated, invisible network of values and valuations that the artwork develops, because objectively, the value of this glass is just value of the glass, right? Less than $1, 50 cents, right? So art is a beautiful place to play around because it's one of those spaces there is no objectively measurable performance, yet there's clear differences in success. There are hugely successful artists who get millions of dollars for their artwork, and then most artists get nothing, right? Virtually nothing for it. And it was in that context that we actually started to explore how does artistic success emerge, and we were able to show that we can predict very accurately the future career of an artist by looking at only one particular network, which is the institutional network and their location where they exhibited. And what do I mean by that? by looking at kind of the exhibition history of about 500,000 artists, we built a network of how the institutions are connected by joint exhibitions, meaning that they exhibited the same artist. Like if Museum A exhibited Warhol and Museum B2 exhibited, there's a link between them because we consider that they have a similar perception of what contemporary or modern art is. And using that network, if you give me your favorite young artist and you can give me what museums or galleries he or she exhibited it, we're able to fast forward their career and tell them what's going to happen 10 or 20 years from now. Because value in art is emerging through this institutional network, right? The institutional network reflects of what the community thinks about your work and eventually determines your future success. And what we see in art is really true for all areas where performance is not measurable, right? Once again, we can distinguish between bad and good, but once you're good, then it's not enough to perfect your performance any longer, right? Then you need to start asking yourself, what are the networks that determine my future success? And in art, everybody thought, oh, your buddies, the other artists that you're hanging around. And we showed, no. The only thing that matters in this case is the institutional network that eventually shows your work and opens up gateways to be shown in other places as well, and eventually to be sold and so on. And what we see is that in each area, there is a network like that, right? And if you want to be successful in an area where performance is not objectively measurable, then you need to pay just as much attention to understand what is the network that drives your success in that specific field, as you must pay attention to really improving your performance. And I will just want to add one more thing there. Anything that we talk about the formula and what our research shows is never a recipe have to be successful if you have low performance, right? I don't think anybody can do that for you, but it is a recipe that if you have the performance, what it takes to be at par with the best, how do you translate that into success?
Wow. Can I ask about the role of preferential attachment and garnering
Sure.
their success?
Yes. Well,
And
preferential
you
judgment is
define the term as well.
yeah. Well, it's something that we kind of discovered in 99, right? In the context of the World Wide Web, as we're trying to understand the surprising discovery we made that year that networks had major hubs between them, like web pages that have hundreds of millions of links, people who have many more friends than others, and so on and so forth. And it was very unexpected, and also the existing network models could not explain that. The existing network models said that networks should be randomly wired, and randomly wired networks don't allow for hubs. And so we proposed, that turned out to be subsequently true, that there is a preferential attachment that is responsible for that. That if you are embedded in a network, the more links you have, the more future links you will gain. So that is that simply your connectedness drives your future number of links. And this was a proposal at that time that we showed mathematically creates networks that agree with the real ones. In the subsequently, we and others, and now it's a standard procedure, were able to show explicitly that it's not just a hypothetical proposal, but that preferential attachment is there and is measurable. So what does preferential attachment tell us? It tells us that previous success drives your future success, right? And in the context of success, this really comes in together with the network piece, right? Because once again, if you have a strong performance and it's mostly performance, and that is obvious and measurable, then that kind of overrides everything. In reality, however, we all have performance, and we actually call that the fitness parameter, right? We all have something that we're good at, and we may not be able to measure it, but there is a variable that tells us how good we are there. And really, the future performance is a product of that fitness, or my ability, times my existing success or existing visibility, because you need the fitness or the skill to be recognized, but your network, that is the number of links that you have, tell you how many people have seen your performance, right? And it is them who's going to take it to other people, and through them it will continue to grow. And so really, this is kind of the third law in the book, because the book is organized into discrete laws that apply in different situations, which is to say, fitness times previous success determines future success. And in the technical language, we call this preferential attachment. That is, the more friends you have, the more friends you will gain. Because think about it, if you have no friends, no one will introduce you to anyone, right? And the more friends you have, the more opportunities you have to be introduced to everywhere else. If you write papers with many citations, right, then many people will read it and they will cite you again. If no one cites your work, no one reads your work, and hence you cannot get future citations. So in all areas that you look at, the connectivity really matters, the network really matters, but the network is always different. And this is why I think everybody, whatever area you work in, you have to think very deeply about what is the network that matters to my success. And you should actually focus on that network. And I already kind of alluded that in the art space, most artists think that it's their other artists are defining the network that they are, because if other artists speak highly of them, then they will be regarded well by the community. That network has no influence whatsoever on artistic success. What has influence is the institutional network. That is the curators and the museum professionals, because it is them who will then show your work, not your fellow artist, and then eventually will propel you to success if you are destined for that.
What did J.K. Rowling publishing books under a pseudonym teach you about success?
Well, that was a beautiful example, right, of the power of the network. Because J.K. Rowling, when she decided to actually, some way questioning her own powers, right? So after that exceptional success with Harry Potter, that really was unparalleled when it came to publishing. I think it's really what she did there really has no parallel in the number of copies ever sold, right? As any other creator, she questioned herself, right? That anything that she does at that moment will be just simply because she's already so successful. So she decided to test that and do a beautiful experiment for us, right? She ended up writing a thriller and published it under a pseudonym. And what was interesting is that the thriller got very good reviews, yet it didn't sell, right? So everybody acknowledged who read it that the performance is there, but it lacked the network effect, right? Because it was an unknown author, right? And in the moment it was revealed, she denied it for a long time, but eventually it was revealed that she's the author. The book became an instant bestseller. So this is a beautiful control situation, and we have a few others in the book that offer controls in this of how really performance and success play together. And we have the opposite one as well in the case of art, where two young artists start their career together and do virtually indistinguishable art, and they do their art together. And then they break up, and 3 years later, one artist becomes the most famous artist of his generation, who ends up selling eventually a work for $150 million. And the other one is totally gets forgotten. And the famous artist who doesn't get forgotten is Jean-Michel Basquiat. And yet very few people outside of the art space know of his body, where they started their career and they did virtually indistinguishable work. They would do it together. So we have kind of several control studies that we discuss in the book that helps us kind of understand how performance and networks really play together, and to underscore the major point of the book, that you must pay attention to both, and you must understand what do you lack when you are not having the success you need, whether is it performance or success, so that you can focus your attention on those two things.
I want to ask you, does the genius label sell?
Well, I look at the genius label as a little bit overhyped by a certain generation of people, right? But it's just a measure of admiration for that individual, right? And one way we could say that the genius label doesn't sell is that there are so-called genius grants provided by the MacArthur Foundation, and most of those people, even though they got the genius label, are not viewed as geniuses by the community. They are fabulous people at what they do, right? But even when a very prominent foundation gives them $500,000 and labels them as geniuses, doesn't turn them on. Geniuses is really kind of a humanity's way to acknowledge somebody for exceptional performance and for great impact into the kind of on the community what they belong to, right? Whether the artist or scientists and so on. And by the way, we did lots of research on genius, and they're very segregated with certain professions, right? Can you name me an engineer genius?
No.
Can you name a physicist?
Yourself?
No, that is not, it's easy to name, like anybody from Einstein to Hawking to everybody else, right?
Of course.
It turns out that geniuses are mostly physicists and a few biologists and a few artists, right? And other professions lack labeled geniuses. So it's a human construct. It's a societal construct. In certain areas are much stronger than the others to label that exceptional performance genius. This is not to say that what Einstein did was not exceptional. It was certainly exceptional, right? In what he did in those kind of few years that he was really research active. And even later in his 50s, the work he did in quantum mechanics was truly exceptional. And it's remarkable to have one person who can do so many things in their career in science. So, but nevertheless, genius is not an objective measure of performance or success. Well, no, not an objective measure of performance. It is a measure of success in certain areas, right? And they're very, very segregated in certain areas and don't exist in others.
Einstein was also labeled for saying, if you haven't had your greatest scientific breakthrough by the age of 30, you'll never have it. And I know you have very mixed opinions on that, Laszlo.
No, I'm not mixed opinion. I have very clear opinion. It's bullshit.
I was being subtle.
Yeah. And we know why he said it, and we know why he was wrong, right? The reason he said it is because he looked around in the community that he really respected, and mostly the community of the quantum mechanics generation. Everybody from Dirac to Planck to everybody. Well, actually, Planck is probably good, but Dirac, Schrödinger, and so on. And he realized that most of these people, including himself, right, did much of the work that really made them famous for in their kind of mid to late 20s and occasionally early 30s. So it was kind of easy to conclude that if you miss that window, you will not succeed. But one of the things we actually showed that this is simply not true, and it's a biased effect of looking only at the most successful individuals. And this was something very important for me because, listen, I mean, you look at me and I have graying hair, right? And one of the big questions I ask myself, is it even worthwhile to try to do science at beyond 50? Right? If you listen to Einstein, I should just do a podcast or something else, right? Because I don't any longer have the brains, right? And the ability to do serious science. So my way of answering these questions is to look at the data. And we did that, right? We ended up looking at all scientists that ever produced anything in science, right? The successful ones and the non-successful ones. Everybody was in our data set. And we asked them, at what stage of their career did their most important work? That is the highest impact work. And that's kind of measurable because we have what we call citation measure. And these are mostly close career people who are already retired. And we can actually, from 1900 to today, and we can say, when did you do your biggest, most important work? And we did actually confirm, in a way, what Einstein was saying, because we saw that most people did their highest impact work in the first 10 to 15 years of their active academic career. Your academic lifetime starts when you publish your first paper, and the clock clicks from there, right? So 10, 15 years in your academic lifetime, you did most of your research. And if you go out of 15, then the probability that you do a work that in impact overcomes your earlier work is dropping to zero. It's less than 1%. So based on this data, it looks like I should not be doing any science, right? Because it's very clear that the likelihood of me discovering something bigger than I did before is very low. However, the problem with this data as it is that it's very similar to one Einstein did, right? He just looked at what was the age in which people that he knew discovered the biggest things. But he didn't correct for what we call productivity. That is, when do you write your papers? So instead of putting the age, why don't we just order all the work you did, all the postcasts you did from one to the latest one, right? All the papers that scientists published from one to the last one, all the paintings an artist has made from the last to the very last one. And then we ask, in the sequence of papers, in the sequence of podcasts and papers, which is the most successful? Is this the first one or the last one or in the middle? And it turned out it didn't matter. It was totally uniform, the probability. Some people had it at the very end, some people in the middle, some people at the early stage, some people at the very first one. And so then what's going on? We do see that younger people tend to make big discoveries, but it seems that it doesn't matter really whether it's your first or last one. And the key is productivity. What turns out is that what we were seeing and what was Einstein seeing is a productivity curve. That in the space of projects is totally random, which is going to be most successful. But young people do most of the projects. It's like when you are young, you publish most of your papers. When you are young, you have the energy to do podcasts, right? And lots of podcasts every day if needed, right? And so there is a very strong productivity bias towards young people. But success or impact is like a lottery, right? In the space of the project you do, they appear with equal probability. However, if you buy most of your lottery tickets, or virtually all of them in the first 15 years, and you stop doing that after, it looks like you can only win a lottery if you are young, right? And that's what we explicitly showed. We showed that creativity and the likelihood of impact has no age, could emerge at any stage of your career as long as you are willing to continue doing what you did earlier. That is, you continue to work, to publish, to do podcasts, to do sales, whatever you want to do. And what happens, and the reason why we have this youth bias, is that often people give up for family reasons, health reasons. Sometimes they become very successful and they get other opportunities. Like, if you're a professor, you become a dean or become a president of the university and you stop doing research. But fundamentally, what we see is a major drop of trying, right? Or the likelihood of trying. And indeed, when we look at the data, we found people who got Nobel Prizes for the very, very first paper they published as a student. But we also found a professor from Yale University who published his most important work after he was forcefully retired by Yale.
Is that John Fenn?
Then John Fenn, right. And then he went to another university, a much less prestigious university, and it was there where he made the discovery that eventually led 15 years later at age 85 to his Nobel Prize in chemistry. And when you look carefully, you start seeing everywhere these late boomers. We call them occasionally late boomers, the people who really made their career or make big impact late in their career. And the data is very clear now across multiple fields. It's the lack of trying that kind of eliminates people at certain age and people who are willing to continue, like John Fenn. John Fenn passed away at 93 a few years ago. his obituary said that 3 days before he passed away at 93, he was still in the lab working on his next experiment. That's the secret of success, right? Is to keep trying over and over, particularly if you have your performance and if you know what you're doing, then you have a responsibility towards you and your environment to keep trying until you break through.
So many of the listeners will be taking a deep breath of fresh air and thinking, good God, creativity has no expiration date. I'm on to my next win soon.
Yeah. And they should. And they should just, think about what's their next project.
Why should you wear colorful socks to a job interview?
Well, there's an even stronger effect than the colorful stocks. Be among the last to interview. Right? So that's the recency effect, which is really showing that, again, when you're getting a job is not about performance, but about lots of auxiliary things, right? And one of the strongest, which is shown in many, many data, is the recency. I always tell my students who kind of get an interview for a job is to say, okay, now go ahead and call them before you accept the interview and ask them when they're making their decision. And then ask for the latest possible date within that time frame. Because research over and over shows that the first to interview will be forgotten immediately. And the people who win competitions and jobs are typically among the very, very last one to interview. I got my first faculty position as the very last interviewee.
Wow. Why are we even evolutionarily designed to favor recency? What does it say about us as a species? Do you know?
Well, it's interesting. Evolutionary, we were not played to kind of run jump interviews, right? We were kind of aimed for survival, and it is just simply the way I think about it. The first people you interview are there to gauge the scale of what kind of person you want. And then you pick from the last people after you set your scale based on that, who will be your hire.
I had a wonderful lady called Logan Yuri on my podcast a couple of years ago, and she's the head of relationship science at the dating app Hinge. And she made me aware of something called the secretary problem that's very similar to this. I'm not sure if you've came across the secretary problem, but it's a mathematical example whereby if you're hiring for a secretary, in the instance whereby if you say no to a candidate, you can't call them back. She said that the best time to recruit someone is after you've interviewed 33 people. And at that moment, you pick the best candidate. And if someone matches or is better than that candidate, you automatically say yes, because you have seen basically the larger variation of talent within that pool
This
already.
is actually proven mathematically. You have to let the first 1 over e, where e is the exponential number, 2.71. You have to let the first 1 over e fraction go, which is roughly 30%, right? And then indeed,
Scientific background.
but the real number is 1 over 2.71 and many, many digits, right? and that has actually been proven, right? And then you just hire the first one, indeed. Well, but that only refers to the situation where you cannot call the people back, right? So you're not going to sit down at the end and decide, but you must decide on the spot, right? It's really called the dating problem, right? or the wife problem, is that you cannot just simply say, hey, I'm going to go ahead and date the 10 people and then go back to the third one because that was the best one. Right? You have to date and choose, right? Cannot continue that. So it's a very famous dating problem and has been mathematically proven. But that is not necessarily recency. Recency, it's not disconnected to that, because there's an intuitive feeling of that we first kind of gauging the people and then we decide. But often it's a memory issue, right? Is like simply how well do we remember the first performance and how much impact the last performance have in us. Whatever the reason, it's there. So make sure you're never the first to interview if you want to get that job.
And there is the argument that the interviewer could get more competent throughout the interviews, and that could be a reason to why he enjoys or she enjoys the last interview too.
Yes. And the interviewer learns what he or she wants. through the first interviews, right? And then eventually hire somebody from the list, from the latest ones who kind of match those qualifications. So it's not unlike the dating problem, right, or the secretary problem, but it's a little different because you do have the option to interview multiple people and go back and choose the first one if you want. Yet you don't, right?
Laszlo, to end the podcast, if I were to ask you, what's one law or one technique that every listener could take forward into their daily life to improve their life through network science, what would it be?
Well, I really think that the most humbling law of this book that really changed my perspective about things is the fact that success isn't about you, but about us. Because on one end, it told me that me as a member of the community, I have to be humbled about the fact that I have a responsibility to help others to succeed. So it's not only about me succeeding this law, it's also about my responsibility as a community to help you and others, in particular my students and my collaborators, to succeed because their success is about me.
I love it. Like I said, I've been reading your book since I was a teen. It was gifted to me by a mentor, Ben Lucas. I now give it to other people. This is a full circle moment for me, Laszlo, and I'm so glad that we could make it happen. Thanks for your
It-
time and thank you for your work.
it's a pleasure. I'm glad we could make it happen.